Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and this is the Political Postbox, which is where we take a look at your comments. So some of the more engaged comments over the past week from the channel. But first of all, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the first one is on how the government would intend to persuade us that we're still okay even if we're doing really badly. And obviously it is a bit of a worry that the government will just seek to fool us. The statement here saying it's okay everyone, the Tories know how to hide the unemployment numbers so nobody will even notice when half the country's out of work. And it is true, you know, the Office for National Statistics as well as other independent groups have basically said the unemployment numbers that the government are peddling are not consistent with other data, and it's because, of course, although the Office for National Statistics, for example, which is the body in the UK that analyses government data, does so properly. It does a proper job of it. It doesn't get lent on by government. In fact, the reverse, it often tells government off for misusing statistics. However, it is still reliant on its data from government. The government orders the collection of the data and they get to define certain terms like what unemployment is or what employment is. So they can only use the data the government give them. But they know from other data that it's not at all consistent. You know, when, for example, you can have people who are unemployed, you know, you were to describe a particular person, circumstances, their employment circumstances, everyone in the country would go, yeah, that person's unemployed. But the government would say, no, they're not. So they hide millions. And last year it was quoted that it's very likely the actual unemployment is 3 times higher than it really was. So yes, they are going to try and hide it now. But what I've always sort of argued, and we'll find out in a year or two, I suspect, if I'm right or not, I may not be, it is speculation, is that a couple of things. First of all, one, when it comes down to it, you know, if you've got someone who's in a crap job or it's a crap wage, or they're even taking real terms cuts, because that's actually more insidious when people are in work and they're sort of getting by, but what they don't realise is that actually their pay is going down. Because from their point of view, it isn't. It'll be the same wage as it was last year. Or it might even be slightly higher, you know, a few pounds higher or something like that. But in real terms, that's down, because if your pay increase year on year doesn't keep up with inflation, then your actual pay in real terms is going down. But that's easy to disguise. What's less easy to disguise is when someone loses their job and cannot get another. And you know, I've always sort of argued, ultimately, people, you know, you can tell people at the moment that the economy's booming, even though it's not, it's stagnating. You can tell people that unemployment at its lowest level for decades, even though it is not. But you can tell people that because the unemployment figures, as high as they are, still represent a small minority, and I mean a small minority of all people who need to work. You know, in other words, they can't fund themselves from other sources. They actually need a job and they're looking for a job. It affects very few people. So the vast majority of the country, you can absolutely convince that everything is fine. This is why you deny poverty. There's lots of people in poverty that know it's real, that know that they are in poverty, but you can disguise it from the majority because that is still affecting a minority, even though it's millions of people. It's about to be millions more. But if that unemployment really did increase, and obviously the half the country out of work is an exaggeration. It doesn't have to be anywhere near that. But if it gets up to like a critical mass of people, it becomes much more difficult to deny, even for those who are in work. And also, those people who do end up losing their jobs, livelihoods, and cannot get another. That's the important thing. Losing your job's one thing. Can you get another? I mean, you'll get some people who might be able to get another on lower pay. Well, their circumstances are crapper, but you may be able to hoodwink those a little bit. But if the people can't get a job at all and they cannot maintain their standard of living, then those are the sorts of people that will go, sod you telling me that the country is booming. I personally am not. And the strain it'll put on their families and all the rest of it, they are much less likely. That, you know, a lot of people will at that point, even if they were Brexit supporters, become much more selfish about it and think, well, it's all right them saying now, I don't mind losing my job for Brexit, it's worth it. When they actually try it, when it actually is an experience of theirs, they may change their minds. So that is very much what I'm hoping. I'm not hoping lots of people lose their jobs, but I'm hoping that a critical mass of people realise that it's damaging to them. Because there are some things where it's obvious. If a person loses their job, yes, they can be told that, oh, right, yeah, sorry, you were one of the unlucky ones, you lost your job, but actually millions more gain jobs. It's very difficult to persuade people of that. But the bottom line is this. Will they accept that? Or will they think to themselves, but actually I've lost my job because of this? And if enough people realise that they personally have done very badly, then that could tip it again in the general election, which is already in a few years' time going to be much more difficult than any previous one was because of what Boris Johnson is putting in place. But anyway, that's my thoughts on that one. Next one. Right, sorry to inflict this on you. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Basically, as you can see yourself, I'll read the first couple of lines so you can get the general gist. It says, after reading these, the EU is one step to destruction. News today. It feels like prison Polish factory making blue passports face investigation as underpaid and poorly treated by French staff. Company tells staff quit, blah, blah, blah. It's lots and lots of individual little headlines that are supposed to be attacking the EU. And this, I keep coming, I'm going to have to come back to this one. There are a few things that keep coming up in terms of the pro-Brexit narrative, because ultimately, not everyone who tries to push Brexit is an idiot. Let's be clear about that. And many of them will realise that Brexit doesn't actually do us any good. That, when you try and say, give me a benefit of Brexit, they can't. And they also recognise that they can't. Some people don't necessarily recognise that they can't, but many people do. So then what they try, and one of the common things to try and come along with is, oh, the EU is a sinking ship. We've just left the sinking ship. It's doing really badly. And of course it's not. Obviously, the UK leaving the EU damages the EU. There's no point in denying that. It'd be ridiculous to deny that. The EU is not going to do better without the UK. The UK was a massive market within it. It's just a much smaller market than even what's left of the EU, which is still much, much bigger than the UK in terms of population, in terms of spending power. And that is why, for example, the United States has said, yeah, we were going to discuss a trade deal with you, but you've annoyed us. And actually, we really need a trade deal with the EU. And, particularly, it may have been true. Donald Trump may not have been lying. I'll come to this a bit later when he said that he was going to give the UK a quick trade deal. But circumstances changed there. And Australia and New Zealand, same thing. Australia are in, real serious discussions with the EU about a free trade deal as well. Not the UK. They're not bothered about the UK. And there are other economies that have already agreed comprehensive trade deals with the EU, who, may well want to talk to the UK because they're not having to choose between the two. But the countries that are choosing between the two are choosing the EU. The EU is more important. The EU is not a sinking ship at all. And when people they'll point to little things like, oh, yeah, this country's going into recession. Yeah, recession happens. All countries go through a period of growth and recession. The key thing is, what does a country do to try and stave off recession, and what does it do when it's in it to get out of it really quickly? Because that's the thing. If you look at the UK over the last few years, the economy has stagnated. It wasn't really a cycle of growth and recession. We have just stagnated at near zero. Whereas other ones, if you're growing at several percent a year, and then for about half a year you go into technical recession, or it goes low and then it goes into recession for a half a year or so, and then back out of it and back into several percent worth of growth again. It's not actually a big problem. Whereas when your growth is stuck at 0.5% for years on end, that's worse. That is actually worse. You're falling behind then. And we have fallen behind. We have fallen behind. People, the Brexiteers will keep saying, oh, we're the 5th largest economy in the world. No, we're not. Used to be. Were a few years ago. Not anymore. Keep up. So, yeah, this one is quite common. And ultimately, when someone's making this argument, they've run out of arguments because they're now... Because this is the last refuge. It's literally like an anti-Blair, Labour supporter just coming up with Iraq war. It's when it's their last thing left. They've got nothing. They've got nothing to attack the record with. And so they come up with this. Except there's actually things you could actually attack Blair for without resorting to that. But in this case, it's like the thing, I ain't got anything. Yeah, the UK is going to do badly outside of the EU. But actually, in the long term, it'll work out because actually the EU is going to collapse. And if the EU was going to collapse anyway, then we'd have done badly. And then the other thing you could try and say to them is, so let's say the UK was still part of the EU, and let's say the EU failed and it just collapsed. Why did we need to leave? What harm would it do us to be part of the EU while it was collapsing? They go, oh, drag us down, failing euro and stuff. We're not in the eurozone. We're nothing to do with the euro. Oh, but we'd have to bail it out. No, we wouldn't. No, we wouldn't. When the euro did badly a few years ago, did we bail it out? No, we didn't. It's nothing to do with us, not our responsibility. It's that simple. No responsibilities when it comes to the euro at all. It's not our currency. It is an EU currency, but it's not every EU member's currency. It's only those in the eurozone, and that's all there is to it. So there is no argument, even if you thought the EU was doomed, which I have to say it's not. It's actually getting bigger. Obviously, it has now just got a bit smaller, a lot smaller, but when you consider all the free trade deals that have come online recently, I mean, that compensates to a certain extent, and America is now very, very keen on negotiating its own free trade deal. America is by far the largest economy out of individual nations in the world. When you stack it up against the EU, all of a sudden that's a big rival. But, in terms of individual countries, the US, massive. So the US, if it gets a free trade deal with the EU, will always be the single biggest customer for the EU. And again, that would certainly compensate for the loss of the UK as well. But sure, keep going on with those arguments. Next one here. So I can't hear that's not the Brexit I voted for complaints anymore. Yes, stupid it is, we told you so, but you chose not to listen. I suppose part of this was prompted by the tweet over the weekend. I do want to sort of talk about this a little bit. So there was a tweet over the weekend of someone trying to get through customs at an airport, which is known for being a very busy airport. I forget which one now. I'm not a traveller. I'm sorry. And they were going, oh, this isn't the Brexit I voted for. And everyone's taking the piss out of them, going, well, we told this was going to be a disaster, that Brexit was going to be really bad. Now, a couple of things to point out here. One, the reason why this poor man, I can say that, is having the piss ripped out of him. It's not because he's seen Brexit for what it is, because he hasn't, because we're in the transition period. Any difficulties he's having getting through customs within the EU is just because it's busy. And because we haven't had any travel restrictions placed on us yet. We're in the transition period. When we leave, it will be much worse. So this is just someone experienced a very busy airport. They've never been to a busy airport before. And, they just didn't realise that this is just affecting everyone. But the reason why, I think that people are taking the piss out of them is not because, this is Brexit, because it's not. That, there are some impacts of Brexit that are going to be hitting us now, but not many. It's going to be muted. Most of them are going to be in 2021 once we've left the customs union and the single market. At the moment, what we've given up is influence. At the moment, and also we're exposing the fact that actually the world isn't tripping over itself to do trade deals with us. Because, for the last few years, when the likes of myself and the other remoners were saying, oh, where's all these trade deals then? Oh, we're not allowed to talk about trade deals until we've left the EU. Okay, we are now allowed to negotiate and implement trade deals. We might struggle to implement some trade deals if it's at odds with the conditions of the transition period, but we can certainly negotiate them, get them signed and sealed, and delivered even. Where are they? We were told they'd be immediate. And I mean immediate in real terms, not immediate in political terms, which could take, years. I understood that in diplomatic terms it could take years to do. But no, they'll be done straight away. Some of them are ready to go on day one. It's day 17. and the rest will be just ready by the end of the year. Okay. But while we're in the customs union and the single market, we're not going to be put under the cosh too much. Now, for me, what was particularly amusing about it, if you in a sort of gallows humour type of way, was the fact that this person doesn't actually know what Brexit is, or they don't. It highlights that they don't understand what their relationship or what our relationship as the UK has ever been with the EU. The fact that they could mistake a thing for being caused by Brexit just meant that they didn't understand the thing in the first place. And that's what you're going to have. And that's what Boris is going to work against Boris Johnson as well. Remember, he has promised a lot. He has promised the earth. He has promised things that he knew at the time were undeliverable. He initially promised them in 2016 when he decided to come on the side of Leave, because he thought it would be politically advantageous for him to support the Leave campaign, but for the Leave campaign to lose. And he couldn't understand how people would be daft enough to vote, Leave. In fact, he probably himself voted Remain whilst saying he was a Leave supporter. And he just thought it was politically expedient, knowing that David Cameron was going to be stepping down in that parliament anyway, not necessarily as early as he ended up doing, but in that parliament. He would have been gone by now, regardless of what had happened. And he wanted to be the next Prime Minister, and he thought to himself, right, I'll get all the Leave supporters on my side by pretending I'm a Leave supporter. They'll lose, but, there it'll be. And he won't have to go through with it because there's been a referendum on it. And he wouldn't, for example, be able to issue another referendum without having to offer it, because he could argue, well, if we offer another referendum so quickly on this, we'll work towards it, but we can't offer one really quickly, because then we'd have to give one to Scotland again, and we can't do that because we're the Unionist Party. Be easy to argue that. And now he'd argued the earth last year as well, because he again needed it to become Prime Minister. He didn't become Prime Minister. He didn't get to become Prime Minister when David Cameron stepped down. He still had that ambition. The only way to do it was to go full-on unicorn, and that's what he chose to do. But he's offered an awful lot now. He's promising an awful lot, and he's got to either deliver or, and this is much more in this way of thinking, convince people that he's delivered. It's going to be much more difficult, especially if people are mistaking hardships that are nothing to do with Brexit, because there'll always be some of those. There's always things that happen that are a little bit frustrating in your life. Let's face facts. And if people mistake those for Brexit, that's just going to add to him. There's going to be enough things that are actually due to Brexit that he's going to get stick for, and not unreasonably. But yeah, if there are going to be things, that's what was amusing me, if there are going to be things that actually aren't anything to do with Brexit that he still gets stick for, I'm not going to be complaining about that at all. Next one. So, okay, coming on to the US trade deal here. I'll add a few things into here. So it says here, Trump was never really that interested in a trade deal with the UK. He was only interested in weakening the EU and the euro. Now, I think he absolutely was interested in a trade deal. Apart from anything else, remember, he published that the proposals last February. He didn't have to do that. He could have just promised verbally great things in a trade deal without actually throwing. In fact, by publishing that, the nitty gritty, that opened it up for criticism. I've criticised it plenty, others have as well, because it's absolutely appalling for the UK. He didn't have to do that. There was no need to do that if he wasn't actually all that interested in it. I absolutely think that that's the reason Putin wanted Trump to promise this great trade deal. But I think Trump genuinely meant it. So why the turnaround? Because, oh dear. Which one is it? There we go. I was grabbed it. The trade deal actually does represent a really good deal for the US. But again, like I said, it's just a case of priorities. America aren't stupid. They're not going to try and negotiate deals with large economies around the world all at once. They want, presumably, I'm not an expert in this. I listen to people who have been involved in trade negotiations when I'm trying to learn the ropes, so to speak, but I've not experienced myself. And I can imagine that you want your best negotiators in well, you've only got one set of best negotiators. So, they're choosing the EU over the UK. The EU is more important. But was Trump lying? I mean, the suggestion here is that Trump was just stringing the UK along, and as soon as we left, he was always going to say, no, actually, we're not that bothered. Because they are bothered. They do want a trade deal with the UK. Of course they do. Anyone wants a trade deal with anyone else as long as it's in their favour. Of course. It's a case of priorities. EU more important. And I think that is a change of plan. I think what's happened is Donald Trump engaged, of course, with his trade war with China. He had a little dabble with the EU as well. I don't really remember, a couple of years ago. That did not go well for him. That did not go well. And again, I've said it before. Sorry if I'm boring some people who've heard this before, but I'll just say it again because it's worth noting how the US negotiators are also known as being really, really effective, by the way. But the EU are also really good at engaging in little trade wars, which I think is why most people don't really engage with them. So America have done this twice. George Bush Jr. tried it. That didn't go well for him. And then Trump tried it. Because what the EU do, normally what happens in a trade war is one country puts up tariffs, customs duties on some goods from a particular country. So Trump tried that with China, for example. He said, they're taking advantage of us. Obama signed up to this weak deal, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to put up the tariffs on these things, get some of our business back. What normally happens then is then the other country, in a tit-for-tat, face-off, puts up tariffs on some of your goods. And usually they'll pick some of your most lucrative exports to do as much harm to your national economy as possible. Key exports they'll target. The EU don't do that. They're more cunning than that. What they do, because they don't want the trade war to escalate or go on forever, they want a quick stop to it. So they target. What they do is they identify some key figures within government. And they look at where they live. What are the chief exports from there? Not the whole country, just there. And they target those. And that's what they were doing. They were targeting senior Republican representatives that could put pressure on Trump to stop being a bloody idiot. And that's what they will do again. But the other thing is, the trade war with China did not go well. I wouldn't say America lost as such. I mean, America is is a much larger economy than China. China has that potential, but it's not as large as America yet. So when Trump's saying they're large enough to win any trade war, again, it's not always to do with the size of your wealth or But America was suffering. I mean, it's one of these things, like in a real war, both sides ultimately suffer. One side may come on top, but you're both suffering along the way. And, America wasn't doing well out of it. So he's now signed a trade deal with China. And you would think has been chastened by the experience. And that's why his advisors, who were probably all along telling him not to get involved in trade wars, have probably now got the message home. So now they've probably said to him, you need to get a free trade deal with the EU. You don't want a trade war with the EU because they're even more canny operators than China and representing a larger economy as well, collectively. And so he's probably now fully seized of that. So it could well be, even without the Huawei blow-up, that they may have still decided to do that anyway, because they can't afford a trade war with the EU. They're not going to get into a trade war with the UK because the UK is desperate. We haven't really got anything to bargain with. Whereas the EU are known effective operators on the global stage. Excuse me. So are America. But again, it's not going to do anything good. If they couldn't easily and quickly beat China in a trade war, they're not going to be able to do it with the EU. I don't think Trump, I don't think he was even thinking deeply enough. I'm sure it was, told to him, the EU is a competitor of the US. If you do this, it weakens the EU and therefore strengthens the US. I'm sure that was told to him. But at the end of the day, I think he really was interested in a trade deal with the UK and still is. He's just prioritising elsewhere. Next one. So this is about Suella Braverman, the new Attorney General, who's been appointed specifically, because she doesn't have much experience, she's very young, much younger than I am. And what experience she does have is in the American legal system. But she's been appointed specifically because she's fully on board with destroying the independent judiciary, making it, politically controlled. And someone's saying here, another Trump move. I'm watching and counting and noting she doesn't need to know English law. She only needs to know American law, as this is where we're going. Right. First of all, it's another Trump move. Actually, this one isn't, is it? Because America has had this politicised, senior judiciary long before Trump. It's got nothing to do with Trump, has it? In fact, how long does that go back? Does it go back all the way to the beginning of the United States? I don't actually know. Someone tell me. But it has certainly been around all the time I've been aware of American politics, and I'm quite sure much further beyond that. The idea that you will just, whichever party, and it's a particular problem in a two-party system, whichever party is in power gets to appoint them, and then they're appointed for life, and you end up with a situation as is now, where you've got a leaning towards the Republicans. It outnumbers, the Republican judges outnumber the Democrat ones. And on key issues, there may be some issues where they genuinely make unbiased judgments. But on the big cases that make the global news, it's always along party lines. Very partisan. And that's not justice. That is not. They don't even deserve to be called justices. And, for us to move to that situation would be quite appalling. But saying here she doesn't need to know English law, she only needs to know American law. Oh, no, she does. She needs to know English law. Because remember, she'll be advising the Prime Minister. He has the power to do what he wants. Absolutely has the power to do what he wants. But he still has to do it in the right way. He still has to do it legally. Otherwise, there will be legal challenges. Until he manages to push through these changes to the judiciary, it does. And even if he does get to push them through, it doesn't mean to say he gets to do ridiculous things. I mean, there will probably come a point where even biased judges will go, hang on a minute, you ain't going to get away with this. But whenever he wants to do a thing, he needs the advice to know whether it's lawful. Because if it's not lawful, he will be taken to court. We know that from before. The fact that he has a majority in Parliament doesn't stop someone taking him to court. It doesn't stop the governments with majorities do get taken to court. For both parties, Labour and Conservatives, always sort of sometimes trying to sail close to the wind and go beyond it and get taken to court. Sometimes the government win, sometimes the government don't win. At the moment, that depends on whether or not they're in the right or the wrong, or from a legal point of view. Boris Johnson wants to move to a position where it makes no difference. He will just be in the right all the time, whether he is or not. So if Boris Johnson thinks he can do something and she's advising him, this is totally legal, and it's not, someone is going to take the government to court. That court is going to say, no, this isn't legal. And he's going to have lost. And it's going to waste time for him. It's going to waste a lot of time if he goes along a path that ultimately doesn't get him what he wants because he's received poor advice. And this now is one of the my main hopes. The fact that, and this is going to come into the last statement as well, sort of a little segue here unintentionally, that she is incompetent, and as a result of that incompetence, it may, I don't say may, because there'll be other legal advice available as well, slow them down to the point where if Labour can get themselves into a position of effective opposition, they may not get time to go through with the worst of their plans in the time they have available. That is my hope. It is at the moment a hope, not an expectation. I've got nothing really to base it on other than the fact it's conceivable. And then on to that final one. So someone's saying here, I'm going to have to disagree with this, I'm afraid. It says, nothing is more dangerous than an incompetent government. Is it just me, or does anyone else get the feeling that the UK will become Europe's poorhouse again? So the first statement first. Nothing more dangerous than incompetent government. Oh no, there is. It's a little, now, as a teacher, particularly when I've been a teacher in schools, which I haven't done for a few years, but when I was. When it came to like what you might call naughty kids, there were effectively two types. There were the ones who were naughty just because they didn't really know better. They weren't bad people. They just hadn't been brought up all that well, or maybe they had issues or something like that, something going on in their life. They weren't dealing with the stress very well. You know, those sort of ones. But then you had the ones which I used to term calculating evil. These ones knew what they were doing. They could behave themselves if they wanted. They chose not to. They were just unpleasant people. And that's what you have to worry about. You say nothing more dangerous than incompetent government. We've got an evil government, and I mean genuinely evil. I'm really not exaggerating with that. They're evil. They specifically inflict malice on us. It goes beyond just being a bit selfish. Like, Conservative governments I describe as being rather selfish. And they don't realise, many of them don't realise that selfishness is bad. They just think, work hard and you will get your rewards. And they think that it's all right to look down on people who are on low wages or no wages at all because they didn't work hard enough. They didn't work hard enough at school. They didn't, they're not working hard enough now. It's their fault. But they don't mean to be bad. They're not malicious. That's just what they believe. And what we've got now is beyond that. It is actually malicious. It is malicious. And they actively seek to do harm to others. The fact that he's trying to wreck the Constitution, he's trying to remove independent judges. Various governments at various times try to rewrite boundaries in their favour, but the scale at which Boris Johnson is threatening to do it is quite huge. Threatening to abolish the licence fee of the BBC. All of these things are deliberately intended to cement his personal power. And that's an act of evil. And so in that situation, when you've got a country that actually intends harm upon its own country and its people, ask yourself this. Would you rather they were competent or incompetent? Because I would prefer them to be incompetent. As I was saying in the last little comment, my hopes rest now on the fact that Boris Johnson and his ministers are truly incompetent. And there are actually reasonable hopes of that. Because if they are, then there is real hope. Much of the civil service will not be in favour of what's going to happen now. So they are much more likely to be of the mindset. Minister gives them an order. Oh, yeah. That's what you want, is it? All right, I'll do that then. Knowing full well if they implement it exactly as that minister's asked for, it'll be a shambles. But that's fine because a shambles of an evil plan is better than a well-executed evil plan. So no, I'm going to have to disagree with that one. On the last one, is it just me or does anyone else get the feeling that the UK will become Europe's poorhouse again? I mean, at the end of the day, it won't be like the poorest country in Europe or something like that. But in terms of falling behind, yes, it's already started to fall behind and it's going to obviously pick up pace if Boris Johnson, again, I keep saying if, goes through with it, because I have to acknowledge that there are still people who cannot believe that Boris Johnson is really going to go for his no-deal Brexit at the end of this year. I have to say, on the evidence, he is. But I can't be certain, because who knows with his shifting brain. But if we do, then of course, yes, we're going to fall further and further behind. We'll be a large enough country and we'll, it's not that our trade drops to zero, even, on WTO terms, our trade doesn't drop to zero, it just drops a lot. Massively, in fact. But there are still going to be things we make that other people will buy, even if it ends up costing more, and so on. So, and then we may find other markets, other things we have to do in order to keep going. It's just we're going to face a massive reduction, which is going to cause us to fall further behind the likes of France and Germany, which are already behind. But we're going to fall further behind now. But yeah, in terms of incompetent government, I am now praying for incompetence in government. Praying for it. Because that is the only hope of stopping them. There is no opposition in this country that can actually now stop them because they're too powerful. It can potentially the best thing it can do is to get into the public's eye that what the government are doing are really bad. That's the best thing they can do and get public opinion against it. That could also slow them down. But ultimately they need to hope that the government try to do a thing and mess it up. So anyway, that's this week's Political Postbox. Hope you found it interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then also please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.